Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and today on the Roundup for Wednesday, April 1st, 2026, we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last 7 days. And as we do each week on the Roundup, we take our questions that we ask on Wednesdays from the news stories that we put out in our newsletter that comes out on Mondays. And that comes out in 2 different versions, either an email or LinkedIn version, both of which now between them have over 3,000 subscribers. We finally crossed that 3,000 subscriber threshold, so very humbled and proud that so many of our international education colleagues around the country and indeed the world are taking advantage of this short, digestible, hot takes on all the major news stories of the day that we see popping out in our international ed news feeds. And we consolidate those into one easy to read 5 to 10 minute read each Monday morning in either the email or LinkedIn version that puts them in 4 main categories. We have a social media category that has evolved to mean basically anything digital, whether it's a webinar, how social media is being used in international education to recruit students, upcoming data reports or digital AI kind of topics that you need to be up to date on, what the latest is. So the newsletter has that section, then a U.S. Central, which focuses on kind of new legislation, any pending government vetoes, or any executive orders or new interpretation of regulations, all the various things that we deal with on an ongoing basis, kind of the top level news in our industry in higher ed, international higher ed in the United States. And then we focus on a solution central. We need solutions in this day and age. Some of the problems we face seem insurmountable, but the reality is when we work together, we can put our heads together and kind of come up with solutions that make sense for the world that we're facing. Then we can do it together, and then when we share these kind of success stories, we all benefit. So that's kind of the goal of the Solutions Central section. And then finally, a global roundup. And why is that important? Well, that goes back to our 6 Ps of strategic international enrollment management that we created during the pandemic. It was codified into a book chapter in Entry Points to U.S. Education that came out a couple of years ago, and been very humbled by the feedback I've gotten on that 6 Ps as kind of a guiding set of principles for things to include in a strategic international plan and to help manage what you're trying to implement on campus. For number 1 P in there is perspective, not only a local perspective on what's happening on campus, a national perspective on how you fit in as an institution on the global landscape, but more also globally, what's happening in other countries and how their policies and changes that they're making to immigration regulations are impacting positively or mostly negatively international student interest in those countries, at least for the Big 4. So that's our newsletter. It comes out on Monday. Subscribe to that. I've dropped the link to the website where you can subscribe either through the online request form if you want to subscribe, or subscribe via the LinkedIn version. So you have either of those options, and we're happy to be providing this content. And now this is the 349th version of our midweek roundup. So we're very excited that next week, next Wednesday, April 8th, will be the 350th edition of the midweek roundup. So we'll be very happy to be bringing that to you next week. Now, as I mentioned, I do want to, for those who aren't yet subscribed and haven't received this week's edition of the newsletter, I'll drop the link to the LinkedIn version of the newsletter into the chat. And all the links to the stories I'll be talking about today can be found in that newsletter link. So that will help you, guide you along as we progress through these 3 questions. Let's get right to the first one. And that is, what's more important, TNE or dual degrees? This is something that I think in the kind of political climate we find ourselves in the United States especially, we are dealing with political realities that are impacting immigration, impacting higher education, and international higher education is kind of in the crosshairs of both of those. So what does that mean? choosing between TNE and dual degrees. And when I say more broadly, it's the differences between what TNE actually is, and that's having your programs delivered in any number of 3 different ways in another country. It can either be with a hybrid situation where it's some of your courses there are taught in person, some are taught online, fully online programs, or a bricks and mortar campus that you built, or in more common circumstances, partnering with an existing institution to teach your classes in person on the college campus of a partner. So in terms of what that looks like. And China, as we all know, has become very much a hotbed in terms of the way the government is approaching TNE. They're actively seeking out partners and have a newly revised and more streamlined, for China at least, a streamlined process for getting approval for TNE degrees, where your programs are offered in China, typically with a partner university in a 3+1 or a 4+0 kind of environment where the campus basically hires faculty to teach your programs, adds in their own courses so that the students get basically the equivalent of a home country degree and your institutional degree in the 4 years. So the questions are being now asked, and we know from the mid-noughties through to the late 20-teens, we saw hundreds of thousands of Chinese students come to the United States, primarily for undergraduate programs. And that was just a huge boom. It flooded most of our state universities around the country for a good 10 years before it dropped off quite dramatically after the pandemic or during the pandemic. So the question now is being asked in China. Many of those students, families certainly economically aren't as able to afford a 4-year degree overseas, so they're looking at other options. They're looking at lower cost options closer to home, going to Hong Kong, to Korea, but now those numbers are dropping off, but going to other places in Southeast Asia that might be culturally similar to them, but offer internationally English taught degrees that they could benefit from. So they're deciding between these lower cost, closer options, more culturally closer to their own Chinese culture, or the traditional going abroad route. And then the third route is this TNE option within China, with all these U.S. schools, but also European, British, Canadian, Australian schools that are trying to establish these 4+0, 3+1 programs for bachelor's degree programs of theirs to be delivered in country. So Chinese students are now looking at, well, families are now asking, should they go abroad for the full degree? Maybe only part of the degree that last year, or 2+2 programs, or should they choose a transnational education pathway in China? So the families in China, for example, have more options available to them, not just destination countries, but destination modules or degrees in terms of where they want those to be delivered and what universities and what countries' universities they want to consider. So these pathway programs, 3+1+1, where they get a 2-degree program, finish their bachelor's degree in that first year in the U.S. or whatever other destination market, and then that second year is fulfilling a master's degree program. US, UK, Australia are all kind of offering these kinds of models as well. We do something and have been doing something very similar with our polymer science program, #1 in the world at the University of Akron. With a number of Chinese universities, we have a 3+2 program. Fourth year is in the U.S. on our campus, where they're doing research projects, internships to round out their bachelor's degree requirements back home, and also preparing that first year of a master's program so that in the second year they finish a master's degree with us. So that is a model that we are looking to do in other countries as well. With other programs, other variations on that theme. Our law school is even considering offering a 3+2, where that fourth year is finishing their bachelor's degree program, but also improving their level of English. Our law school has a much higher threshold for English, a 7.0 instead of a 6.5. So students typically need a lot more English prep. A 6.0 is our undergrad IELTS score, so they typically will need a year to get up to a 7, and that year on campus helps them get their English up to snuff, get some prep work done for final pre-law classes that they might need for our law school for that LLM program. So there are all sorts of different variations. So the question is really, is it a dual degree? Is it a 2+2, 3+1 variation, or is it a full TNE opportunity in China or in another country? And I say this, what's more important or what's greater value to scare us off or say it's a binary decision here. It's not. And in fact, it can and should be both. In terms of how institutions approach TNE, how they approach partnerships with other institutions. Because let's face it, most of our institutions in the U.S., we don't have budget to go building bricks and mortar campuses like the NYUs and the Duke Kunshins of the world have done for years. Those that have had other countries' governments pay for them to be in certain places in Doha, in Qatar, other locations as well, where there's been strong government support for setting up an institution, years of working and with students from a particular country, like we see the University of New Haven in Saudi Arabia, 3 decades of enrolling students from Saudi Arabia, and that's allowed them to be the first U.S. school to open up a campus in Saudi Arabia with, I'm sure, a lot of government help. So the question is now, are those the only options? No, it's not. TNE isn't the only option. It might be long-term the safer bet, and in terms of being able for delivery of education programs around the world to international students, to diversify where students can take your degrees, not just who gets to take them on campus, because we know, and the data is pointing this direction. In the last 2 years, we've seen significant drop-offs in student visas issued, 60% fewer Indian students getting visas last summer. No real insight yet that the corner has been turned. For some institutions in our state of Ohio have yet to get any students with I-20s for the fall. Thankfully, we're not one of those, but to be at beginning of April and not have any students have been successful in applying for visas yet, that's disheartening. It's not boding well. So covering your bases and having alternative pipelines set up to get students into your degree programs is the wise bet at this point. We're facing 2 more years plus before the current administration is out of office and potentially significant change happening. We know probably with new legislation, if depending on how the midterms go between now and November when the midterms happen, that's the last great chance for this administration to probably get any of its main priorities passed that require legislative action, because we know in November the midterm prognosis is if the Republicans lose either the House or the Senate, then that will kind of put the kibosh on getting any real progress done in terms of legislation in the last 2 years of their term. So we're seeing a corner potentially being turned after the midterms in terms of long-term political change for legislative change, but doesn't necessarily rule out the potential for regulatory change. And that's one of the things that's happening. Potentially, we're still waiting for the other shoe to drop with the DS situation and OPT. Any changes there will have massive consequences overseas. And what I see and what I'm hearing from my travels, when I've been on the ground meeting with students, what I'm hearing from colleagues who are in markets constantly, and their feedback has been, hey, students are playing the waiting game right now. They're looking at other alternatives, and that's a message certainly we should be conveying to our administration on campus, that hey, we're in a really tough situation internationally right now because of what's happening with visas and the damage that was done in the last year in terms of all the series of incidents that happened with the CVIS terminations, the visa revocations, the month-long pause on visa appointments last summer, the implementation of the new social media checks, all the other things, the inability to go to a third country to have a visa interview, the requirement of visa interviews for everybody, including visa renewals. the shortening of visas for a number of countries, particularly in Africa, to 3-month single entry. Lots of cumulative impact of what's happened with visas, with visas this year for the fall 26. Certainly spring we saw a decrease, but not as severe as it probably could have been. For fall this next year, we're ahead right now, but that's only because of internal transfers from within the United States, not from visas awarded from outside yet. So it's going to be tough. It's going to be a tough fall, and are we going to make up the volume in the last 4 months before classes begin, where we'll have enough lead time for students to they are getting appointments. We know that. We've had a number of appointments already go through, but they're not getting approved. In some countries, financials are now becoming even more important. That we're being told visa officers are asking for not only funding for the first year, but proof of where the funds are going to come from to pay for year 2, year 3, year 4 for undergraduate students. So the goalposts may have changed in terms of what's actually being required in a visa interview, and that's catching a lot of students off guard. So it's certainly something we're addressing with our visa interview service provider that we work with, made up of former consular officers, and understanding what the real challenges are on the ground in each location. So we're seeing a lot of uncertainty, not only amongst the students, certainly the folks we work with on the ground, our agency and other partners. They're telling us, hey, students are waiting right now, and until they see a greener light, greener pastures, and better situation with visas. And right now they're not getting that in some very key markets, certainly in India and Nepal especially. So we'll see what happens. But having other options where for the next 2 years students could be starting a bachelor's degree program in their home country in a 2+2 arrangement, and then coming to you after the elections in 2028, maybe coming in 29, and they can have that opportunity to finish their program here with us in the United States. Those kind of partnerships, frankly, are ones that are already currently being viewed more favorably by our folks in consulates in certain countries. They're saying, yeah, if I can see documentation that they're students coming to complete a bachelor's degree because there's an existing arrangement between your institutions, that adds value, adds weight to that student's case for why they have legitimate intent, student intent. So this is something that I think we all need to be aware of. Certainly there are other political factors coming in. I mentioned the examples in China that there are many institutions, not just from the U.S., but from other countries that are looking to set up agreements, and they're becoming much easier to get as relative in a relative sort of way as far as China goes. But there are certain states where politically that's not possible if you're a state institution. In Texas, in Florida, they can't set up new agreements with public institutions. Can't set up new agreements with institutions in China. And there's other states that in Ohio, we have a little not restriction, but we have to get programs approved through the Chancellor's office if we're going to offer any dual degree or other kind of partnership programs with institutions in China. So there are a lot of different realities that are impacting what we're able to do on the ground. But the two articles I refer you to are the Family Calculus T&E in China versus full degrees overseas. That Charles Sun, regular contributor to our newsletter in terms of his LinkedIn pieces that he puts out weekly. Really good source on Chinese T&E. The other is from my friend and colleague Greg Holtz at University of Central Missouri, who asked the question about dual degrees. They sound valuable, but are we really selling them right or organizing them right so that they are truly win-win for the students and the institutions that they're coming from and our institutions? And what the question is in terms of evidence of success. And then where does that come down to? It comes down to jobs. It comes down to that outcomes, the ROI piece. Are students who go to these dual degree programs who do intend to stay, are they getting jobs in the U.S. after they're done? So that's really the proof in the pudding that really shows the success of dual degree programs, and that's something we want to be, if we're going to be actively promoting them, we have to be tracking that very, very closely. We already know how, and we talk about this almost every week here on the Roundup, that the U.S. and international student mobility in general is a much more competitive market than it was 20 years ago. That there are so many more players that are actively seeking the same students. We're recruiting students in India, in Nepal, in China that are applying to multiple countries now, not just multiple U.S. institutions. They're applying to multiple countries. And the average, I think, is we heard from one vendor, 70% of their students are applying to multiple countries now. So that's a fact that we need to be aware of, and that fact certainly tells me that competitiveness means we need to be uber sure of our outcomes and our ROI, and be able to document that through data, but also through anecdotal stories that can tell the real story of, hey, I've gone through this program, here's what I was able to do. We're doing a panel at the end of April where we're going to have a couple of graduates or students in their final year who are doing the kind of co-op program or work prep training programs before they graduate and talk about their experiences getting that first job out. So we are making every effort in how we position ourselves, how we talk about our institutions, how we work with our leadership on campus to reinforce the kinds of issues that are going to be most important for our target audiences. And internationally right now, if you're not targeting ROI, if you're not targeting career outcomes and having data and anecdotal stories to back those up, you're missing a huge opportunity to hit the mark in terms of meeting your students' expectations for what them, particularly at the undergraduate level, and their parents are certainly most concerned about when it comes to coming to the United States. So check out both of those articles. Second question we'll be touching on is OPT. What is the truth about OPT? We want to get to that because there was a recent report released that covers a report, I would say. It was a recent report that has information, actually one of the most probably thoughtful and well-researched pieces on OPT and the history of OPT that I think is something we all need to read. It goes through a review of over 5 million records, talks about a shifting labor market, the case for reforming OPT. We certainly know this administration has their eyes set on changes to OPT. We don't know what that looks like yet, if STEM will still be a part of it or just go back to the original OPT year-long program or make it all two, who knows. But we do know that the program was first launched in 1992. So it's been almost 34 years that program has been around. It was originally designed as a short-term bridge program, training program, in an American economy encountering its longest peacetime expansion in 1992. They expanded it in 2008 to include STEM graduates for an extra couple of years of work during the rise of big tech, and again in 2016 as global competition for talent intensified. Great article, and certainly recommend you read it. It's from Chris Glass, who's actually at Boston College, professor in executive director in one of their programs there at Boston University. So anyway, so the context he says is missing from the current fight over OPT is the history of it and what OPT was originally designed for, what it evolved into with the STEM OPT in George W. Bush's end of his second term, and where it is today. So he makes the point that the OPT data set in 2020 that he analyzed in 2022 to look at the 5.6 million records, the historical record up to that point, what was working, what was broken, and the clear choice is that the government's position might be is that they're looking at between eliminating and protecting OPT, treats it as a single coherent program, and it really isn't. So it's not a binary decision because, frankly, OPT is not the same for everybody. And he makes the contention, and this would require a lot of forethought on the part of those that are making decisions on it. He said the OPT must be designed for the future. It makes the claim that not just because the program has outgrown its original rationale, but because the labor market it feeds into, once again, is being restructured by technology, reshaped by geopolitics, and strained by a structural contraction in entry-level hiring that is hitting American college graduates. So that's the situation that OPT is operating in based on 1992, 2008 kind of history. So really, the article is well designed, and he's not making the case for scrapping it, but certainly a redesign of it. Certainly, that would require a lot of forethought and responsibility on the part of Congress or the administration to redesign it. We have seen a bill. It was in our newsletter a couple of weeks ago that is being bipartisan bill to codify OPT in law, thus making it immune to the kind of regulatory changes that might be in place now in the minds of the current administration. So we'll see where that goes. Excuse me. And the goal of what his piece certainly looks at. The article that we're talked about earlier is a competitive advantage for the United States to have STEM OPT. That those students that are considering the United States right now, 70%, whose top preference is the U.S., are still considering and applying to multiple destination markets. So this is something that we're facing. Even though we have this competitive advantage, we are, in this current political climate, putting ourselves at a disadvantage. Students basically will be turned off coming and even applying or considering the United States, or will drop further down their list if they know that we no longer have OPT. So he's making a claim that certainly we don't want to mess up a good thing. We need to structure it in a way that makes sense for a lot of different potential audiences. And I think what the data that he looks at, and this is something that's always good to know, there were, the most recent data set from 2022 showed that there were 1,969 universities participating in OPT, and 319,203 employers in the United States that were hosting international students on OPT during that time. So those, a lot of big tech companies in there. What I think is important is that you see if an employer does hire internationals on OPT, the likelihood is they're going to hire more. The median employer hires about 3 OPT graduates. So that is probably, some companies higher than others, obviously depending on the size. So it's quite an important piece of that puzzle here. So a really good overview on the CPT situation. Certainly recommend you all have a chance to read that article. So please take the time and educate yourself on some of the history, a lot of which I didn't know. But it's important to have that background and context when you're making the case to your leadership on campus, because hey, they're going to want to know OPT. I know this is something our students can do. They might not have any idea what the actual implications are and what the possibilities are and how valuable OPT is to students interested in even coming here in the first place. So being able to articulate that in some of the historical pieces would be important knowledge that we all should have as we move through our jobs in this field. So let's move on to the last question of the day, and that is, will tighter regulations stifle UK international ed? Last week we had the opportunity to talk about this from an Australian perspective, because they've had, over the past year and a half, had a number of new regulations that are impacting student interest and student ability to even have a chance of coming to those countries. So we've seen the UK do similar, not quite the same regulations, different things. They've had concerns about asylum seekers. A lot of the folks have come to the U.S. on student visas, end up from certain parts of the world applying for asylum at rates much higher than average, and that is putting a strain on government, on resources, all the things we heard about during COVID that were causes for concern. strains on housing, strains on healthcare, strains on transportation, all the other things that are impacted with influxes of what are, for lack of a better term, potential immigrants. So the regulations have caused cancellation of any visas for dependents for students who were coming for one-year master's programs. Though it's still allowed now for MRes programs, research master's programs, which are longer duration. They can bring dependents, but they cut out that dependent route, which is what was many of these students were using to bring in family members, even though they're only coming for a one-year program, and then them transitioning to asylee or other interim statuses that were putting extra burdens on the nation's industries and services. So there have been other changes. They've increased the salary minimums for students who are participating in the graduate route. They've had a new international student levy or fee that's been introduced that institutions need to account for. Many institutions are going to be paying it, or asking or having the international students that admitted to their institutions and want to study there pay that. Some institutions like UCL, University College London, have decided not to charge or pass that fee along to international students. They'll basically cover that cost themselves through endowments or whatever other sources they have. You have a shortening of the graduate route from two years to 18 months. Higher salary requirements for those on the graduate route, as I mentioned. So there's been a lot of movement to kind of tighten restrictions. 4 new countries were placed on the list of where institutions cannot admit students from because of the concerns over asylum increases. So our UK friends are also in an environment where they do have a national strategy for international education. Their new IES was released a couple months ago, and the focus of that IES was not on recruiting more to the homeland, international students to the homeland, but focusing more on T&E, which they do incredibly well. They want to substantially increase their investments in transnational education and recruiting students to do UK degrees overseas. So bringing it back to where we started this conversation on T&E, that's really going to be a focus of UK universities. So everybody's jumping on the T&E bandwagon. In China, in India, everybody's wanting to have campuses and degrees delivered in those 2 biggest markets, delivered there. So that's something that UK universities already have a long history of doing well. And doing well is relative in terms of money making. It's not necessarily the scale is not going to be as great in terms of the volume of the amount of tuition that's generated from those opportunities, particularly if it's on their own facility abroad. But certainly the opportunity exists to have the student count, or bums on seats, as they like to say in the UK. We like to say it too, just a different way in the US. But those regulations are all coming together now to certainly restrict the number of students that will be able to come into the UK to do degrees. Australia, we talked about it last week. They're facing very similar challenges. They've put quotas on, or maxes on what percentage of international students can be at a particular institution. They've doubled the visa fees. They've doubled the work visa fee. So they've really increased English language requirements, increased funding minimums that have to be provided. All of these are issues that Australia is dealing with. UK is dealing with a different set of issues, but still issues that put international ed in a more restrictive bubble. So we'll see what our friends across the pond will be able to do with it in the weeks and months to come. So that's all we have for you this week on the Midweek Roundup. Thanks again for being a part of the conversation. And as we said, next week's going to be a special edition, the 350th edition of the Midweek Roundup. So very much looking forward to getting to you next week on April 8th. Thanks very much, and look forward to chatting with you then. Cheers.